The morning unfolded like any other. The sound of the coffee machine hummed softly in the background, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma of freshly brewed espresso. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall accompanied the quiet moments before the day officially began. My husband moved through the space with practiced efficiency, grabbing his briefcase, adjusting his cufflinks, pressing a brief kiss to my cheek before heading toward the door. "Don't forget we have dinner with my parents this weekend," he reminded me, his tone absent-minded. I nodded, offering a small smile. "I won't forget." And then he was gone. I lingered in the silence he left behind, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. Our routine was predictable, comfortable. There was security in it, but something about it felt mechanical, as if we were moving through a well-rehearsed script rather than experiencing real life. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't miserable. But somewhere along the way, the thrill, the urgency, the raw intensity of desire had faded into the background. I carried my coffee to the bedroom, setting it down on the nightstand before stepping toward the wardrobe. My fingers skimmed through the neatly arranged clothes, moving past the familiar fabrics of work attire, casual wear, and evening dresses. My hands stopped on something different. A delicate black lace lingerie set, one I had bought impulsively a few weeks ago but had yet to wear. I held it up, examining the fine details, the way the lace felt between my fingers. It was beautiful, elegant, subtly provocative. But as I stared at my reflection in the mirror, an unsettling realization settled over me. I had not bought it for my husband. A quiet, electric tension buzzed beneath my skin at the thought. It wasn't conscious at the time, but now, standing there in the soft morning light, I could no longer deny it. I had wanted to feel desirable, but not for the man I had spent years building a life with. The sharp ring of my phone pulled me from my thoughts. I reached for it, expecting my husband's name to appear on the screen. But it wasn't him. It was his stepbrother. A strange flicker of anticipation coursed through me before I had time to question why. I hesitated only for a moment before answering. "Hello." His voice carried its usual casual ease, the kind that always held an undercurrent of something I could never quite define. He needed something, some minor favor, something inconsequential. But there was something in his tone, in the unspoken space between his words, that made my pulse shift. Our relationship had always been friendly, cordial even. But there had always been something beneath the surface, a silent awareness that neither of us had ever acknowledged. A lingering gaze across the dinner table, a fleeting brush of hands when reaching for the same dish, a certain charged energy that neither of us had ever acted upon. Until now, I had always dismissed it as nothing. But suddenly, standing in my bedroom, my fingers still gripping the lace fabric of lingerie meant for no one in particular, I wasn't so sure. I ended the call and placed the phone down slowly. My breath felt uneven, my heartbeat a little too quick for such an ordinary conversation. I turned back to the mirror, the reflection staring back at me was the same, yet something felt different. Would he notice? Would he care? And more importantly, why did I want him to? I pushed the thought away and forced myself back into routine, throwing the lingerie back into the drawer and pulling on something safer, something ordinary. But the idea had already taken root. That evening, I prepared dinner as I always did, setting the table with the same practiced motions I had repeated for years. My husband returned home at his usual time, pressing a kiss to my temple as he passed, his mind already occupied with something else. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice distracted. "Fine," I answered, tucking my hair behind my ear. "Yours?" "Busy. Meetings ran longer than expected." I nodded, offering another small smile. He sat down at the table, already reaching for his phone as he scrolled through unread emails. I watched him for a moment, searching for something, anything, that might pull me back into the version of us that once existed. But the distance between us had become so normal, so effortless, that I wasn't even sure when it had begun. Later that night, as I lay beside him in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the day. The call. The way my body had responded to something as simple as hearing his voice. The realization that a door had been unlocked within me, one that I hadn't even realized existed. I shifted beneath the sheets, glancing toward my husband. He was already asleep, his breathing slow and even. I turned onto my side, pressing my fingertips against my wrist, feeling the steady rhythm of my own pulse. There was nothing inherently wrong with my life. Nothing tragic, nothing broken. And yet for the first time in years I felt like something was beginning. Something I couldn't ignore. The air inside the restaurant hummed with low conversations, silverware clinking against porcelain plates, the occasional burst of laughter from nearby tables. The lighting was dim, casting a warm glow over the polished wood and linen-covered tables. It was the kind of place that exuded quiet luxury, where reservations were made weeks in advance and the staff moved with seamless precision. I sat across from my husband, my posture straight, hands resting delicately on my lap. He was speaking to his father about business. Something about stock fluctuations, investment opportunities, and upcoming acquisition. His mother nodded along, occasionally interjecting with polite curiosity, while I remained silent, stirring the lemon in my water glass with slow, idle movements. I had become accustomed to these dinners, to my role as the attentive, supportive wife who smiled at the right moments and listened without interrupting. It wasn't an unpleasant routine, just an expected one. And then he arrived. His presence was felt before I even looked up. The way the energy at the table shifted, the way my body became suddenly hyper-aware of itself, the weight of my dress against my skin, the delicate press of my heels against the floor. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself before finally lifting my gaze. He greeted the table with an easy confidence, slipping into the seat beside me as if he belonged there, as if this was where he was meant to be. His voice carried the same effortless charm I had always associated with him, words spoken with just enough weight to command attention but never force it. He smiled, and for the briefest moment our eyes met. It was nothing. A glance. Second too long. But it was enough. The meal unfolded as expected. Pleasant conversation, laughter where appropriate, stories from childhood that had been told and retold so many times they had lost all sense of authenticity. Yet, beneath the surface something else was at play. I felt it in the moments he leaned in slightly, in the way his fingertips grazed the table's edge near mine, in the subtle shifts of his body when our knees brushed under the table. It was all unspoken, all calculated in its innocence. And yet it was anything but innocent. At some point I excused myself, needing a moment to breathe to regain my sense of balance. The restaurant's balcony overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out in glittering lights against the night sky. I pressed my hands against the cool stone railing, inhaling deeply. A voice behind me. Oh, familiar. You looked like you needed an escape. I didn't turn immediately. I let the words settle first, their weight pressing against something inside me I wasn't ready to name. I just needed some air, I replied, finally facing him. There was something knowing in his expression, something that made my stomach tighten. He wasn't the type to push, to say too much, to make things obvious. He was patient, calculated, and perhaps that was what made him dangerous. He leaned against the railing beside me, silent for a moment. The city stretched below us, endless in its movement, in its anonymity. You seem different lately, he said finally, his voice quiet. Distracted. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze. Is that a bad thing? No, he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Just an observation. I looked away back toward the city, but I could still feel him there, close enough that if I shifted just slightly our arms would touch. I wasn't sure what unnerved me more, the way my body was attuned to his presence or the fact that I didn't want to fight it. The sound of the balcony door opening behind us broke the moment. My husband's voice calling my name. I straightened, smoothing my dress with a careful hand before turning back toward the restaurant. The rest of the evening played out as expected. But something had shifted. And I knew it wouldn't stop here. The night after the dinner lingered in my mind like a melody I couldn't shake. I replayed the smallest details. The way his fingertips had ghosted near mine on the table, the weight of his gaze when no one was watching, the measured way he had spoken to me on the balcony. It had been nothing. And yet it had been everything. The next morning I moved through my routine with deliberate slowness. I poured coffee, stared at the golden streams of morning light spilling through the kitchen window, and told myself it was just my imagination. I had been restless, that was all. And then my phone buzzed. I reached for it instinctively, expecting a message from my husband, perhaps something about his schedule for the day, a reminder of a dinner we had planned, something mundane. But it wasn't him. It was him. A simple message. Are you free this afternoon? I stared at the words for a moment too long, my heartbeat quickening, fingers tightening around the phone. There was no reason to hesitate. No reason to feel this creeping anticipation, this unspoken thrill curling inside me. I told myself it was just a casual meeting. Nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, as I stood in front of my wardrobe, carefully selecting what to wear, my hands hovered over the fabrics longer than usual. A dress that clung in the right places, shoes that elongated my legs just slightly, a hint of perfume at my wrists. It was not for him. And yet, in a way I refused to admit to myself, it was. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, tucked away from the usual bustle of the city. A place I had been to before, but today it felt different. My eyes swept the room until they landed on him, already seated at a corner table, his posture relaxed, fingers idly drumming against the cup in front of him. The moment I approached, he looked up. There was no surprise in his expression, no hesitation. Just that same knowing gaze, as if he had expected me all along. I took the seat across from him, setting my bag beside me. "You're early," I noted, my voice measured. He tilted his head slightly. "So are you." Pause. A subtle shift in the air between us. I reached for the menu, more to give my hands something to do than because I actually needed it. "What's the occasion?" He leaned back, his lips curling into something dangerously close to amusement. "Do I need one?" I exhaled, shaking my head. "You always were good at avoiding direct answers. I think you just don't like being the one asked questions," he countered smoothly. The conversation moved like a current, effortless, fluid, but with an undertow I couldn't quite escape. We spoke of ordinary things, of work, of travel, of stories from childhood that had long since lost their sharpness. And yet there was something else in the way we spoke, something lingering beneath the surface. I was aware of every movement, every glance, the unspoken tension building in the spaces between words. It was a dangerous game, one neither of us had acknowledged aloud, but both of us were playing. At some point, the conversation slowed, and he studied me for a long moment before saying, "You seem different." I raised an eyebrow. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." His voice was lower now, quieter. "You don't feel it?" I swallowed, glancing away. The truth settled uncomfortably in my chest. I did feel it. I had felt it for a long time. But acknowledging it meant admitting something else. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I checked the time, using it as an excuse to shift the direction of the moment. "I should go." His gaze remained steady. "Of course." I stood, reaching for my bag, but as I moved past him he reached out, just barely, fingertips grazing the inside of my wrist. It was brief, fleeting, but it sent a current through me so sharp it was almost dizzying. I didn't look at him as I left. But the ghost of his touch stayed with me long after I was gone. The drive home felt longer than usual. The city blurred past me, the muted hum of traffic filling the silence in my car. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles turning pale under the pressure. I replayed the moment over and over again. The way his fingertips had barely skimmed my wrist, the way it had sent a shiver through me, unbidden and undeniable. It was a touch so small, so fleeting, and yet it had unraveled something inside me that I wasn't ready to confront. I shouldn't have met him. I shouldn't have allowed myself to sit across from him in that cafe, knowing full well that this wasn't just a casual conversation. There had been something loaded in the way he had looked at me, in the way his voice had softened when he said I seemed different. Because I was different. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my heartbeat had settled into something steadier, something controlled. I took a deep breath, fixing my expression into one of normalcy before stepping inside. The house was quiet, the faint scent of citrus lingering in the air from the candle I had left burning earlier. It was a familiar scent, comforting even. But tonight it felt different. I set my bag down carefully on the entryway table, listening for any signs of movement. A few moments later I heard my husband's voice from the other room. "You're home early," he called out. I walked toward the living room where he sat with his laptop open, papers spread across the coffee table. He barely looked up as I entered, too focused on whatever work he was buried under. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice light. The meeting I had got cut short. He nodded absent-mindedly, scrolling through something on his screen. "Dinner's in the fridge if you're hungry." I got home late, so I just ordered something for myself. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was such a small moment, but it made my stomach twist in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't that he had eaten without me, or that he hadn't asked if I wanted anything. It was the ease with which he assumed I would handle things on my own. I walked into the kitchen, opening the fridge and staring at the neatly packed containers of food. I wasn't even hungry, but I took out a bottle of water just to have something to do with my hands. I heard him get up from the couch, stretching before making his way toward me. He leaned against the doorway, watching me as I took a sip. "Everything okay?" he asked. I turned to face him, forcing a small smile. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" He studied me for a second longer before shrugging. "You just seem distant lately." The words struck something deep inside me, an uncomfortable recognition of the truth. I was distant. But not because of him, not in a way he would ever understand. "I'm just tired," I lied, placing the bottle back on the counter. "Work has been draining lately." He nodded, accepting my answer without question. "Maybe we should take a weekend away. Just us. It's been a while since we had time for ourselves." I exhaled slowly, guilt creeping up my spine. He was trying. And yet the idea of a weekend alone with him didn't ignite anything inside me. Not the way a simple touch on my wrist had earlier that day. "Maybe," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Let's talk about it later." He smiled, pressing a brief kiss to my temple before heading upstairs. I stood there for a long time after he left, fingers curled around the edge of the counter, my breath feeling heavier than it should. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside him, I found myself staring at the ceiling, just as I had the night before. But this time my mind wasn't just replaying a touch. It was wondering how much further I was willing to let this go. Sleep came in restless waves, fractured and fleeting. Each time I closed my eyes, my mind betrayed me, conjuring up the memory of the cafe, the heat of his presence across the table, the way my pulse had jumped when his fingertips grazed my wrist. It was absurd how something so insignificant had become the focal point of my thoughts. But it wasn't just that moment. It was the accumulation of 1,000 others, silent and unnoticed, stretching back further than I was willing to admit. I turned onto my side, listening to the quiet rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. He had fallen asleep quickly, his body relaxed, his mind at ease. For him everything was simple, stable, predictable. There were no invisible lines being drawn, no battle waging between want and restraint. For me it was different. By the time morning arrived, I felt drained, as if I had spent the entire night running in circles inside my own head. I went through the motions of getting ready, choosing a dress that I told myself had nothing to do with him, applying lipstick with an attention to detail that should have been meaningless. It was just another day. That was what I told myself over and over again. And then the text came. "See you tonight?" My stomach tightened. I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard before finally typing a single word. "Where?" A few moments passed, then his reply. "The bar downtown. 9. I could have said no. I could have ignored the message, deleted it, let it become another moment that would pass like all the others before it. But I didn't. The day stretched on in excruciating slowness. I told myself I was overthinking it. It wasn't a secret meeting. It wasn't an affair. It was just a drink between two people who had known each other for years. That was all. And yet, as the evening arrived, I found myself staring at my reflection, adjusting my hair more times than necessary, second-guessing my choice of heels, of perfume, of everything. My husband was on a call when I left, barely looking up as he waved me off. "Don't be too late," he said absent-mindedly, his focus already elsewhere. I nodded, closing the door behind me, feeling the weight of something I refused to name settle over my chest. The bar was dimly lit, filled with the low murmur of voices, the occasional clink of glass against glass. I spotted him immediately, seated in a booth near the back, a glass already in front of him. As I approached, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said simply. I slid into the seat across from him, exhaling slowly. "Should I not have?" His lips curved slightly, amusement flickering in his gaze. "I didn't say that." The server arrived and I ordered a drink, my fingers tapping lightly against the table as I waited. "Does he know?" he asked casually. I tensed slightly. "Know what?" "That you're here." I held his gaze, steady but guarded. "Does it matter?" He tilted his head, watching me with a curiosity that unsettled me. "Maybe not. But I think you're wondering if it does." I swallowed, my fingers tightening around my glass when it arrived. "This isn't an affair," he finished for me, his voice low, measured. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "That's not why I'm here." He leaned forward slightly, his presence an unspoken force between us. Then why are you? It was a question I had no answer for. Or perhaps I did, but I wasn't ready to admit it. Not to him. Not to myself. So instead, I took a sip of my drink and let the silence stretch between us, heavy with everything neither of us dared to say. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged. The weight of his questions still lingered, settling into the space between our bodies like something tangible. I should have answered. I should have given him some dismissive, logical response that would have put a firm boundary between what we were and what this was threatening to become. But I didn't. Instead, I lifted my glass to my lips, letting the sharp burn of alcohol distract me for a moment. His eyes never left me, studying every movement, every hesitation, every breath I took as if trying to dissect the truth I wasn't ready to admit. I set my drink down with a soft clink against the wooden table, my fingers tracing the condensation along the rim. I don't know, I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended. It wasn't a lie. His lips pressed together slightly, and for a moment I thought he might push, might force me to say what we both already knew. But instead he leaned back against the booth, his fingers tapping idly against the side of his glass. You don't have to. His voice was calm, almost too composed. Not yet. I hated how easily he read me, how he seemed to know exactly where the line was and how to hover just close enough to it without crossing. The minutes stretched on, the sounds of the bar fading into the background. I was aware of every inch of space between us, of how little it would take to erase it completely. And then it happened. Not in some grand dramatic moment. Not with some drawn-out confession or impassioned argument. It was smaller than that. Simpler. But somehow it felt inevitable. I shifted slightly, and as I did, my knee brushed against his beneath the table. It was the lightest touch, fleeting, barely noticeable. But I felt it everywhere. I should have pulled away. I should have pretended it didn't happen. But I didn't. Neither did he. For a moment we just sat there, frozen in that single point of contact, our breathing suddenly quieter, our gazes locked in a silent understanding. And then slowly, deliberately he moved. Not much. Just enough for his leg to press against mine again, to hold there, firm and unmoving, a question unspoken. My fingers curled slightly against the table, my pulse hammering in my throat. This was it. This was the moment where I made a choice, where I either severed whatever thread was pulling us toward something we couldn't undo, or I let it happen. The logical part of me screamed to stand up, to leave, to remind myself of the life I had spent years building. But the part of me that had spent too many nights lying awake beside a man who saw me without really seeing me, the part of me that had longed for something unnamed and unspoken, that part stayed. And then he leaned in. Just slightly. Just enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the flicker of something dangerous in his expression. I think, he murmured, we both know why you're here. My heart slammed against my ribs. And then, before I could second-guess it, before I could convince myself to run, I let it happen. I let myself lean in just enough. And his lips met mine. Soft at first, tentative, like testing the edges of something forbidden. And then the restraint shattered. His hand moved to my jaw, fingers pressing just enough to tilt my face up to his, deepening the kiss, stealing the air from my lungs. I should have stopped it. But stopping was the last thing I wanted. The moment our lips parted, reality came rushing back. The sounds of the bar, the distant hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, the muffled laughter, seeped into my awareness as if I had only just remembered where we were. I should have felt guilt. I should have pulled away the second it happened. But instead I remained still, my breath uneven, my pulse wild beneath my skin. His eyes lingered on me, unreadable in the dim lighting. He didn't move away, didn't break the moment. He simply watched me, waiting. I inhaled sharply, forcing myself to straighten, to create even the smallest space between us. But the heat of his touch still burned where his fingers had rested against my skin, and my body betrayed me, leaning instinctively toward him before I caught myself. I began, my voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't know how to finish the sentence. This was a mistake? This was inevitable? This was exactly what I had wanted all along? I pressed my fingers against my temple, exhaling slowly. I should go. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't argue, didn't try to stop me. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. I'll call you. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me as I grabbed my coat and turned toward the exit. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside, grounding me, forcing oxygen into my lungs. I had kissed him. Oh, we had kissed. And worse than that, I had wanted it. The truth of it pressed against my ribs, threatening to break through my carefully constructed denial. I could try to convince myself that it had been a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness. But deep down I knew better. This wasn't something that had happened in an instant. This had been building for months. Maybe even years. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel as I stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I expected to see guilt in my eyes, regret, something that would remind me of who I was supposed to be. But all I saw was someone who had finally felt something for the first time in a long time. I forced myself to drive, to put distance between me and what had just happened. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were still trembling. The house was dark except for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. My husband was asleep upstairs, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I closed the door behind me carefully, slipping off my coat with slow, deliberate movements. I needed to collect myself before facing him. I needed to breathe. But as I stepped into the dimly lit room, I froze. He was awake. Sitting on the couch, his laptop resting beside him, eyes focused entirely on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then in a quiet voice he asked, "Late night?" I swallowed, keeping my face composed. Yeah. I lost track of time. A beat of silence. His gaze was steady, but something about it made my stomach twist. And then he simply nodded. Okay, just that. Nothing more. I exhaled, giving him a small smile before heading upstairs, feeling his gaze on my back the entire way. I told myself he suspected nothing. I told myself this could still be undone. But deep down I knew. This was only the beginning. I barely slept that night. The moment I closed my eyes, my mind replayed every detail of what had happened. His lips on mine, the warmth of his touch, the way my body had instinctively leaned into him as if it had always known where it belonged. And then there was the look my husband had given me when I walked through the door. It had been subtle, unreadable. But something about it made my stomach twist. By morning I felt like a stranger in my own home. The kitchen was filled with the usual sounds. The soft clinking of dishes, the hum of the coffee machine. But everything felt different, like I was watching my life from the outside. I moved on autopilot, pouring coffee, avoiding my husband's gaze as he read through his emails. It was ridiculous to feel this tense. He had said nothing. Had done nothing. Yet every moment stretched with unbearable weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was casual, but I wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. "Do you have plans today?" I hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking my head. "Just some errands." He nodded, sipping his coffee, eyes still on his screen. "I was thinking of taking next Friday off. Maybe we could get away for the weekend." The words sent a rush of panic through me. I forced a smile, pretending to consider it. "That sounds nice." Nice. I hated how detached my voice sounded, how automatic the lie came. I should have said yes. I should have agreed, let him plan the weekend, let him pull me back into the safety of our life before I unraveled it completely. Instead, I felt my phone vibrate against the counter. I knew before I even looked. My fingers curled around the edge of the marble surface, knuckles whitening. My husband glanced at me briefly, then returned to his laptop, oblivious to the war happening inside me. I excused myself, slipping away with my coffee, fingers already unlocking the screen. "I need to see you." 3 words. Simple. Direct. I stared at the message, heartbeat pounding against my ribs. Every rational thought screamed at me to ignore it. I didn't. That I typed back. "When?" The reply came almost instantly. "Now." I hesitated. Then before I could stop myself, I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. The drive felt both too fast and too slow. Every red light, every turn felt like an opportunity to change my mind, to turn around, to go back home and pretend this moment had never existed. But I didn't. I arrived at his apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel long after I had parked. The weight of my choices pressed against my chest, suffocating, but the pull toward him was stronger than the guilt. I knocked once, twice. The door opened almost immediately. He stood there watching me, saying nothing. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me. And everything I had been trying to resist shattered. The door clicked shut behind me, and for a moment neither of us moved. The silence was thick, charged, filled with unspoken words and the weight of everything we had already done, everything we were about to do. My pulse roared in my ears, my breath uneven. I should have left. I should have turned around, opened that door and walked back to the life I had spent years building. But I didn't. That I stayed. He watched me, his expression unreadable, though his eyes held something dark, something knowing. He had known I would come. He had known from the moment he sent that message, maybe even before that. My fingers tightened around my purse, a nervous habit, a futile attempt at control. But there was no control here. I shouldn't be here, I said, my voice quiet. But you are. The certainty in his voice made something inside me tremble. I opened my mouth, searching for some excuse, some justification that would soften the edges of what we were doing. But there was none. He took a slow step toward me, his movements deliberate, measured, giving me time to stop him. But I didn't. I couldn't. I felt the warmth of his presence before he even touched me, the space between us narrowing until I could feel his breath on my skin. His fingers traced lightly along my arm, barely there, a whisper of contact that sent a shiver racing down my spine. Everything in me tightened, coiled, waiting. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. I said nothing. Because I didn't want him to. Because every fiber of my being screamed for more. Because I had already made my choice the moment I walked through that door. I let my purse slip from my fingers, let my hesitation crumble like a fragile thread snapping under too much tension. And when he reached for me, I didn't pull away. Time blurred. I didn't remember leaving. I didn't remember the drive home, only the sharp sting of cold air when I finally stepped outside, my body still humming, my mind racing. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the weight of what I had done hit me all at once. My hands shook as I killed the engine, my breath coming too fast. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And worst of all, I didn't regret it. The house was dark when I stepped inside, the only light coming from the glow of the kitchen. My husband's jacket was draped over the back of a chair, his shoes neatly placed by the door. The familiarity of it all should have soothed me. It didn't. I moved through the space like a ghost, stripping off my coat, my scarf, my shoes, each item feeling heavier than the last. My body ached, my skin still tingling, but my mind was a battlefield, torn between guilt and something far more dangerous. Desire. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard his voice. "You're late." I froze. The shadows obscured part of his face, but I could see the faint glow of his phone screen illuminating his features. He wasn't angry. He wasn't accusing. But something in his tone made my stomach twist. I forced myself to turn around, keeping my expression neutral. I lost track of time. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze sharp, assessing. And then he simply nodded. "Okay, just that." No further questions. No suspicions voiced. I exhaled slowly, nodding back before turning and continuing up the stairs. But as I reached the bedroom, as I closed the door behind me, one thought lingered in my mind. Did he know? And if he did, what would happen next?